What is a lie? To lie is to intentionally mislead others when they expect honesty. Lies are familiar, commonplace. We all tell lies, to each other, to ourselves, to those we govern, and to those that govern us. But what makes a lie American?
Weapons of mass destruction.
Live cheated, we stole
Proceeding training of ISIL forces.
the American experiment.
Attack by the military industrial.
I will never lie to you. It eliminates asset purchases by the Federal Reserve.
One of the matters for the coronavirus. Pay for itself.
These documents
The Federal Reserve is the money factory of the United States. It's America's central bank. The Fed does a lot and does very little at all. It's basically the control room of monetary policy since 1913, and the topic of conspiracies both inside and outside its doors. Tinfoil-wrapped brainiacs believe it to be the Illuminati swear jar, with round earth apologists using the digital coinage produced to fund the lies of big science. QAnon thinks it's a villainous cabal of Bohemian Grove devil worshippers out to destroy Christendom by seducing their pregnant teenage daughters into stripping, and that God selected Trump to defeat them and their pedophilic machinations. Mainstream media and MMT dunce hats love the Federal Reserve, as long as it pulls the reins on the monolithic carriage ride dubbed the economy, while funding the well wishes of the wealthy who bankroll their airtime and studies. Normal people see that Federal Reserve is printed on the cash in their wallets, and glean that the Federal Reserve is merely your favorite bank's favorite bank. The Federal Reserve began with a conspiracy. You may be aware of the story. A meeting at Jekyll Island, a group of clandestine bankers, lawmen, and the ultra-wealthy and powerful, conjuring up how best to convince both the government and its polity that they should be in charge of the country's money supply, to address the issue of the banking sector's routine insolvency. When challenged by a national event, excessive deposit slip creations, or the loans required by growth obligations of industry. This is a true story with omitted details. It should be noted that the concept of centralized currency manipulation is ancient, and so too is the greed of isolated men who've ran the enterprise of stagnation. President Woodrow Wilson repeated the mistake of a history forgotten when he signed in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. A policy response purported to use the stabilizing measures original to central banks to fix the unreliable nature of capital movement in an evolving free market. A bludgeon to the freer markets, freer people adage, the Federal Reserve Act was anti-American, and President Wilson, a liberal as they make them, signed. Since insemination, the Fed has been at the heart of every economic event and its folklore. The feeding of the 1917 war machine, food farmed by lowering interest rates so banks could buy the bonds germinating the fields of war efforts. The curtailing of inflation following World War I that led to the unsound boom of the 1920s, the choking of the money supply in effort to quell this exuberance, and cowardly closing its doors when depression followed. Price fixing, cartel ventures, and competition hacks thereafter, of which the subtext of monetary policy aided and abetted. The unemployment and inflation crises of the Nixon and Reagan eras. The growing asset classes needed to justify the cargo cults of Wall Street discos, the funding of drug lords and their clientele's proliferation, and the banks created to house the immense profits of narcotics trade, and the governmental response in declaring a war on this euphoric trajectory. Bloating of the mortgage securities and asset classes in the 1990s and early 2000s, the hidden inflation of assets owned by a slimming number of people, the wars in the Middle East, and the proxy battles abroad. Onward and onward, the Fed's invisible hand has manipulated and engineered the minutiae of the world's economy, directly and indirectly, the good, the bad, and the very ugly. The Federal Reserve is and isn't a bank without money, a reserve out of stock, a specter animated by men. It's an independent system, outside and beholden to the government. It's a policy creator, dependent on the belief in its creation's effect. It creates currency from nothing, produces the notation of capital while producing the denotation of its limits. What does the Fed do? On paper, the Fed moves the levers of interest rates to affect the cost and quantity of credit and money in the economy, directly controlling the short-term rates, indirectly influencing the long-term rates, prices of bonds and securities, currency exchange differentials and their rates, equity and asset valuation, and the flow of wealth. The Fed also is able to purchase securities straight from the market, thereby increasing the circulatory flow of money in the economy, which is also known as These abilities are required of the Fed so that they can regulate inflation, increase employment by inducing cheap credit to employers, and maintaining the stability of prices. In reality, the Fed does this and more. What are the consequences? The richest 1% of Americans hold more than half the value of equities owned by households. This is estimated to be around $31 trillion in net worth, or $9.5 million of average net worth per individual. The bottom 90% of households have a total of $1.2 trillion of approximate net worth. Jerome Powell, current Fed chairman, told Congress that the Fed's congressionally mandated goals do not concern the growing income gap, and that the reasons for the perspectives of wealth disparity inequality among the lower echelon are a product of the systemic racism permeating the U.S. economy. Lies told by the Fed chairman are clever. When the Fed created the ludicrous credit that supplied the housing market's growth, the banking sector utilized the endless streams of cheap credit to lend unrestrained and unwarranted, pocketing the billions of profits from the differences. Chairman Greenspan claimed that the deflation of prices was to be avoided rather than the inflation of costs. Then, when credit turned sour and millions of Americans foreclosed on their houses, the Fed lent out $1.2 trillion of public money to the banks that profiteered from the collapse they created, which was roughly the same amount of money delinquent U.S. homeowners owned on their mortgages. Chairman Ben Bernanke said that he was mindful of the moral hazard of saving the banking sector's rabid racketeering, knowing the consequences to the point of pretty much guaranteeing the same immoral duplicity to reoccur. On occasion, the Fed accesses the top private equity firms and asset managers to oversee their efforts. BlackRock profited immensely from the advice given to the Fed on how to stabilize the bond market amid the COVID pandemic, and from the consultation provided to price and sell government assets when Bear Stearns and AIG collapsed in 2008. The same assets BlackRock advised its clients to buy. Forcing interest rates low and disguising congressional profligacy, the Fed is the #1 culprit behind government overspending and the increase of the national debt burden. In the first half of fiscal year 19, the national debt rose 13%, the largest growth on record. The receipt of 2019 has yet to be placed on the tables of America due to the artificial constraint of inflation by reclassifying debt burdens and relabeling of cash as reserve currency. And the Fed's malpractice has only worsened. Charged with moving a substantial portion of the trillions needed for the CARES and HEROES Act, the Fed was never inclined to adhere to the compliance detailed in the stimulus bills. Through economist warnings of utilizing stimulus loans and the quantitative easing in haphazard ways, like buying junk-graded corporate debt, dropping interest rates to zero or below, and purchasing mortgage and treasury securities. The Fed checked all of the above, power-cycled the money printer after it previously overheated, and printed maniacally. It seems it will continue to do so. It may seem as if the Fed has a secret task, to create a pool of shadow currency the cream of the crop have full swimming rights to. This isn't true, apparently. We're told when the Fed prints money and injects capital into the actual economy, it devalues the currency already in supply and ramps up inflation without the justification of economic output. When it's injected into reserves, or there's a deleveraging event, there's none of this pesky inflation. Inflation is understood to be a hidden tax brought on by the government's running past capacity. These and other omitted explanations you learn as an NBA pursuant are but stories. Inflation and its doppelgangers tell a different tale. Inflation damages the bottom 90% due to the structuring of their finances. Their income is from labor, mostly, with some from labor and welfare payments. Inflation benefits the 1% due to the increases in valuation of assets and equity. Their income is from investments. Future generations are expected to foot the bill of the 1%'s gains in the here and now. The bill itself lists illusory charges. The liens and bets against and for the items on the bill are squeezed of the profits by fat cats and successful economic peons, of whom money goes further. That money's validity is dependent on the receipt generated by the Fed, a validity deteriorating because the receipt is redacted and endless in its length. If centralized industries corrupt with ease, then the industry of money and its abuses is the head of the pin. One might argue the Federal Reserve should be nationalized to subdue the manipulation of open markets and our economy, to give up the central banks to government. When government has flaws in its policy and the individuals that operate within the government vie for personal or nepotistic gain, then is nationalizing the central bank a viable option, considering those who would then wield the benevolent money printer. If people knew the secrets behind the concrete, there would be hell to pay. Bankers would have to alter their diets from caviar and champagne to the metal ends of pitchforks and the fires of Molotovs. Luckily for the Fed and its servants, Americans might never know of their deeds, and the depressions and wars engineered tomorrow will distract us from issuing the summons and FOIA requests needed for revolution. Outlooks decay with each passing day. Records are broken, but not the Guinness ones. Economists are ripping their hair out, with a select few warning of a depression unlike anything the West has seen. Their chickened worries aren't little, and though the sky may fall, MMT will print our currency sky high. The future is dire. The state is breaching the failed zone. If stagflation is the doctrinal liturgy, are we in for a dark decade? Without inflation, are we playing a dangerous game with the world's reserve currency? If purchasing power is decreased substantially, will the economic wounds fester until civil is infested with unrest? If we pull back the wealth divide curtain entirely, will people trust any versioning of monetary policy presently conceivable? If the dollar collapses, does war follow? The writing on the wall spells depression. That's undeniable. But it won't be a sequel to 1929, nor a 2008 follow-up. It will be unprecedented. We can hope to call it Nouveau Depression, the greatest deleveraging, and the rewriting of the rules. If we call it anything else, Americans may not be American in 50 years. All the blame in the world is a down payment on the worst loan agreement there is, inaction. So what can we do? We can use our tools, we can make new ones too, but the old ones aren't broken yet, they're in need of repair. As it stands, the tools are retained by others, and we shouldn't trust our tools with them if they continue to misuse and damage them. Combating the system when knowingly feeding its many hungry, gaping mouths is a sign you haven't located your tools, much less repaired them. And you can't reform the system if you lack the tools to do so. What do we do? We inquire. We begin with questions. We can demand answers too, but that comes later. Inquiry is not commonplace, as you may have noticed. Americans often outsource inquiry to others or draft insufficient answers. Don't do that. Inquire. Asking questions requires thinking. Asking questions is pivotal to positive change if they're sound inquiries. Asking questions isn't political, it's integral. First, we have to know what we're interrogating before we can even think of reforming it. After the inquiry, we must begin telling the truth. Americans have been lied to, with cause and without. But what is a lie when we can no longer discern truth? If Americans are to start telling the truth, what will become of their country? If you happen to be American, I'm sure you have a sense of having something stolen from you. This specific thing is variant, but the knowledge of its theft is present. There's a robbery in progress, yet the suspects are everywhere. It's a robbery so ubiquitous, we find the theft preferable to alternatives and invite it into our lives, because the riches are indeed distributed, although unevenly. We benefit until we don't. Is this the America of the people? Have we evaded history's rhyming doom? Is the empire aflame, or is it a sunrise of a new day? Owing significantly more than what has been paid into the enterprise of progress, we're beginning to realize how high our debts loom. And Americans need to pay, both monetarily with the birth and deaths of our future's genius. Genius departed when we arrived in the 21st century. Intelligent, innovative, capable Americans have squandered their calling through little fault of their own. Those who ascend positions of power and notoriety are disappointing. Our leaders play act, produce shabby results, and blame their opposition. Our thought leaders do the best they can, but they're small in number, and it's often too little, too late. Our people succumb to a divide and conquer narrative as the commoner fights for the scraps of what little power is left. Our government has failed. Our economic system has died. This retarded status quo will remain until the system collapses. The problem is, a collapse has already occurred. The undead state of the market should not be. And if American cinema has taught us anything, it's that we shoot zombies in the head to kill them. Corporate criminality should be punished, and the suspects deserve equal treatment under the eyes of the law. The US Constitution is an old, flawed document, but those who swore on it to enter office should read the fucking thing. Figureheads and mouthpieces are up for re-election. Banking overlords, business magnates, corporate threshers, and agency directors are not. You cannot vote for a candidate that will fully serve the interests of you, the individual. Within a supposedly democratic country with free market liberal values, we've profited unjustly and have lost sight of what America ought to be. This is not a liberal society with fair courts. This is not a free market. This is not capitalism or its rewards. It's barely a democracy. It's a lie, an American one.